The focus of our discussion today is, once again, on one of the biblical holy days. This is, admittedly, a relatively obscure holy day. Indeed, it appears on really just one occasion in all Scripture, and even there, obliquely. But I think there's a critically important message for us to glean from how we relate to this admittedly obscure day. The context in which we encounter this day is in the book of Zechariah. The prophecy of Zechariah, in admittedly much the same vein that to this day Jews turn to the scholars to answer questions with respect to how they are to fulfill in practice what the Bible teaches us to do. People turn in Zechariah chapter 7, verse 2, Beit El, Sharezer, Regan Melech, and his men had sent to entreat the favor of God and to speak to the priests who were in the house of the God of hosts and to the prophets, saying, should I weep in the 5th month, separating myself as I have done these so many years? So to understand the context of the question, and altogether the reference to weeping in the 5th month, the 5th month, what we identify as the Hebrew month of Av, is the month in which the temple was destroyed. At the time that the question was being asked to Zechariah and his contemporaries, the second temple had been rebuilt. And the Jews who were still in Babylon were piously asking how they should relate then to the fast that they had been observing in the interim over the destruction of the first temple, now that the second temple has been built. And if you'll allow me to skip to the answer, there is much fascinating material that appears in the interim. The actual response to the question appears in chapter 8, in verse 19, and I suppose one could say the answer exemplifies a very common phenomenon, that when you ask a question, you may be getting more than you bargained for. Because the answer, and the word of the God of hosts came to me, reports the prophet, saying, thus says the God of hosts, the fast of the 4th month, and the fast of the 5th, and the fast of the 7th, and the fast of the 10th, shall become times of joy and gladness, and cheerful feasts to the house of Judah, and love the truth and the peace. So of course, when I speak of getting more than one bargained for, they refer exclusively to the 5th month. The prophet makes reference to 4 fasts: the fast of the 4th month, and of the 5th, and of the 7th, and of the 10th. Those 4 fast days are fast days that to this day commemorate principal events in the process that eventually led to the destruction of the temple. Of course, the prophet doesn't identify the events, nor does he identify a particular date in each of these months. We spoke about the gamut of these 4 fasts last year. We're not going to address that right now. Our focus today is exclusively on that of the 4th month. And again, the prophet doesn't identify just what this fast is to commemorate. For that, we turn first to the very last chapter of the book of Kings. In Kings 2, chapter 25, in verses 3 and 4, we read, and I need to preface to my reading here that your translations may have an extra word. Most do, but I'm going to remain faithful to the Hebrew original. The text reads, and on the 9th day of the month, the famine prevailed in the city, and there was no bread for the people of the land. And the breach was made in the city. The wall of the city was breached. And all the men of war fled by night by way of the gate between the two walls. What is conspicuously missing from this narrative, and admittedly is supplemented in most translations, is the 9th of which month? The Hebrew original doesn't tell us. It just says of the month. Most translations insert the clarification that it is the 4th month. You might be wondering how they know that, and the answer, fairly straightforwardly, is that the identity of the month is explicit, just not in the book of Kings. It's explicit in the book of Jeremiah, where we read first in Jeremiah chapter 39, in verses 2 and 3, in the 11th year of Zedekiah, in the 4th month, the 9th day of the month. It is indeed the 9th day of the month of the 4th month, a breach was made in the city. The event about which we read in the last chapter of Kings, the breach of the wall, took place on the 9th day of the 4th month. And all the princes of the king of Babylon came in and sat in the middle gate, and of course the events unfolded very precipitously to the final destruction. We get the same date in the very last chapter of Jeremiah. Structurally, the last chapter of Jeremiah is practically a replication of the last chapter of the book of Kings. It isn't even really intrinsic to the book of Jeremiah, that is, the next to last chapter ends with the words, thus far, till here, are the words of Jeremiah. And then, again, the last chapter is kind of a synopsis of the events of destruction as we see them presented in the book of Kings. But once again, as in Jeremiah chapter 39, in Jeremiah chapter 52, in verses 6 and 7, we do read explicitly which month. And the 4th month, on the 9th day of the month, the famine was severe in the city, so that there was no bread for the people of the land. Then the city was breached, the wall was breached, and all the men of war fled and went out of the city by night by way of the gate between the two walls. Same event again. So, by way of synopsis, while the prophet Zechariah, in referring to the fast of the 4th month, is admittedly oblique, he doesn't tell us what the fast commemorates. We know very well what it commemorates, because this is the only event that is explicitly associated with the 4th month, the 9th day of the 4th month. The wall of Jerusalem was breached. The famine became intolerable in the city. The men of war fled. The men of Babylon entered the city. Critical milestone in the process that leads to destruction. Now, having stated that, we need to take a jump into a completely different period that includes the present day. Bear in mind that while the prophet Zechariah told those who had sent the question regarding fasting once the Second Temple was built, that those fasts were to be commemorated as days of celebration, days of happiness. Obviously, that was the case as long as the Second Temple remained standing here in Jerusalem. Once the Second Temple was destroyed, the 4 fasts commemorating the destruction were restored as fast days. Except, here we get to a tantalizing historical observation. We don't fast on the 9th day of the 4th month, the day that was undoubtedly observed as the fast of the 4th month in the reference of Zechariah. It's a kind of optional fast that is observed nowadays only by some pious people, or maybe people who don't feel especially connected to eating. The fast of the 4th month is observed to this day by Jews, but not on the 9th day of the month, on the 17th of the month. Now, it's important for us to appreciate that on the one hand, if we ask, is this fulfillment of the prophet's mandate? The prophet, after all, spoke in God's name of the observance of these 4 fasts. My response, at the risk of being excessively technical and precise here, is the prophet only spoke of a fast to be observed in the 4th month. He didn't specify a date. So arguably, to that extent, any date in the 4th month that is observed as a fast day is fulfillment of this prophetically ordained fast of the 4th month, including fasting on the 17th, which this year occurs a week from today, next Tuesday. But inevitably, we still can't help but ask, why not fast on what was undoubtedly, historically, the original fast day, the 9th of the 4th month, when the fast was restored after the Second Temple was destroyed? It wasn't restored to the same date in the month as the fast had been observed after the destruction of the First Temple. Why the shift? If it sounds like I'm quibbling about details, what's an 8-day discrepancy among friends, of course, inevitably, we're concerned here not so much with the technicalities, but rather the lessons that emerge. Because I'd like to present to you 3 very different answers to this question. They all are based upon ancient traditions, and I think each one in its own way presents to us a critically important dimension in what really is, after all, our agenda in speaking of these days and their messages. On the one hand, as so aptly expressed in the words of Moses' song in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 7, remember the days of old, consider the years of many generations, which we could, after all, summarize as, remember the lessons of history. We remember the lessons of history, but of course, simultaneously, we remember the Bible isn't a history book. And even when it tells us of bygone events from years past, it's telling us about them not for the sake of the past, but rather for the sake of the present. The lessons that we need to learn from these events for ourselves, for our own lives. With these words of introduction, I'd like to embark upon my 3 different answers for this question. Why the discrepancy between the red letter date in the Bible, which is the 9th of the 4th month, and the current observance, the last 2,000 years, the observance of this fast day on the 17th rather than the 9th. I should stress at the outset that while we will necessarily explore what significance the 17th has, don't expect to find the answer anywhere explicitly in Scripture. The 17th of the 4th month appears on exactly 0 occasions in all the Bible. Maybe obliquely once, and even then, not in explicit reference, not in direct reference at all to the events of the destruction. But that inevitably brings me to the first answer, which is probably the simplest and most straightforward. As we already saw in the book of Kings and in the book of Jeremiah, the walls of Jerusalem were breached in the 4th month. In the first temple, the walls of Jerusalem were breached on the 9th day of the 4th month. But in the second temple, and this is obviously post-biblical, but it is the object of considerable testimony. The walls of Jerusalem then were breached on the 17th. And inevitably, when we consider then why the fast is observed on the 17th rather than the 9th, the straightforward answer is, after the first temple's destruction, the second temple was rebuilt. After the second temple's destruction, well, we're still waiting for its restoration. The world still lacks God's temple in Jerusalem. So the destruction, after all, that relates to us most directly is this one, the destruction of the second temple. So we observe the prophet's mandate, but we observe it on the 17th because that's the date that's relevant to us. And of course, inevitably, in this regard, I'd say that the message with respect to how we relate to history is we don't relate to history as something that happened then. We relate to history as something that's happening now. When we ask ourselves, which breaching of the wall is still relevant to us in our lives? It is, of course, the breaching of the wall that results in our not having a temple today, and that's the breaching of the wall in the Second Temple period. We study history, but we study history because it impacts upon us. And again, in this regard, the Bible is not a history book. It's here to teach us lessons. The date that the Bible presents was the date that was relevant for those who endured the destruction of the first temple. But for us, the 17th is that much more germane. That's the first answer to the question. Second answer kind of addresses the issue from a completely different perspective. And I'll stress that both of these answers have provenance that goes back almost 2,000 years. The second answer supposes that, in fact, in the first temple period, like in the second temple period, the walls of Jerusalem, in fact, were breached on the 17th of the month, not on the 9th. And of course, inevitably you'll ask, but we have explicit verses in the Bible, the last chapter of the book of Kings, twice in the book of Jeremiah, that speak of the 9th, not the 17th. So how can you say that it really happened on the 17th? The answer, according to this second approach, is that the Jews in besieged Jerusalem were so beset by the siege, so overcome by all the travails that they were experiencing, so confused, they got the date wrong. This isn't such a far-fetched thesis when one recalls that in the book of Kings, remember, The verse doesn't even tell us which month. They may not have even remembered which month it was. They certainly didn't know the date. So they erred by 8 days of the month. And of course, inevitably you'd say, yeah, but if it's wrong, why is it recorded that way in the Bible? To which I'll respond, once again, the Bible isn't a history book. And what message then is there for us to glean from the Bible recording the wrong date simply because that was the date that the people in besieged Jerusalem thought it was? Well, one intriguing proposal that one of the commentators mentions is a message emergent from Psalm 91, verse 15. I am with him in his time of travail, says God. If they're confused, if they're overcome, they're going to record in the Bible precisely what they thought in their state of confusion, in their time of travail. Which again, convey to us an important message about history and the Bible. And the Bible not being a history book. Rather, the Bible being there to teach us. Remember, Torah means teaching. And it teaches us then this lesson, that even though the people in besieged Jerusalem were obviously not paragons of righteousness, God is with each and every one of us in our time of travail. So much so, if the folks in Jerusalem thought it was the 9th, the Bible will cut them the slack and write down the date as the 9th, even if really it was the 17th, just as it was in the time of the Second Temple. So of course, the difference between these two approaches would be, according to the first approach, after the destruction of the first temple, they really were fasting on the 9th. Maybe after the destruction of the first temple, according to the second approach, they were fasting on the 17th once they figured out what the right date was. I don't know. But in any case, what both approaches have in common is we will observe the 17th, either because irrespective of what happened in the first temple, the second temple impacts directly upon us, or alternatively, because in both cases, it was in fact the 17th, and the Bible records what people in a state of anguish, in a state of confusion, in a state of travail thought, because God is with them even then. These two approaches, of course, both pertain to what happened at the time of the destruction of the first, the destruction of the second temples. The third approach that I'd like to share with you addresses this question from a completely different direction. Maybe, as a result, gives us the most sublime lesson that pertains to history. But in order for us to grasp the third approach, we're going to have to engage in some relatively simple arithmetic calculations, not that pertain to the destruction of the temple, actually that pertain to the chronology of events back in the book of Exodus. In Exodus chapter 19, verse 1, we read of the nation of Israel coming to the wilderness of Sinai and encamping at Mount Sinai. In the 3rd month, after the people of Israel were gone out of the land of Egypt, the same day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. And in the following verse, we read that Israel camped before the mountain, Mount Sinai, the prelude to God's revelation. I have to admit, as I already noted, things are relatively oblique here. the text doesn't even refer to a specific day of the month, just that the same day they came to the wilderness of Sinai. Well, in our tradition, the implication of the reference to the same day coming to Sinai is that they came to Sinai on the first day of that month. And having come to Sinai then at the beginning of the third month, it's up to us to try to figure out what the chronology is of the agenda culminating in God's revelation. It's not entirely clear from Scripture. What we can conclude is, since we read about Moses going up the mountain, coming down the mountain and speaking to Israel, going up the mountain again, reporting as it were back to God, descending again, and furthermore, the imposition of a 3-day preparatory period leading up to God's revelation it was some period of days from the beginning of the month until the day of the revelation. In our tradition, the revelation took place on the 7th of the third month. Now, I invite you to join me in some relatively straightforward calculations here. Following the revelation, at the end of Exodus chapter 24, in verse 18 we read, "And Moses went into the midst of the cloud and went into the mountain. And Moses was in the mountain 40 days and 40 nights." I'll note that we read the same chronology as indeed we discussed last week in Deuteronomy chapter 9, that following the revelation, Moses ascends Mount Sinai and is there for 40 days and 40 nights. And what happened at the end of that period? In Exodus chapter 31, in verse 18, we read, "And God gave to Moses, when he had made an end of speaking to him upon Mount Sinai, 2 tablets of the testimony, tablets of stone written with the finger of God, the tablets of the 10 Commandments." And Moses goes down the mountain in Exodus chapter 32, verse 15. "Moses turned and went down to the mountain, and the 2 tablets of the testimony were in his hand. Tablets written on both their sides, on the one side and on the other, they were written. They were the work of God. The writing was the writing of God, engraved upon the tablets. And what sight greets him when he reaches the foot of the mountain? And it came to pass, verse 19, that as soon as he came near to the camp, that he saw the calf, the golden calf, and the pagan revelry taking place round about it. And Moses threw the tablets from his hand and broke them at the foot of the mountain." The breaking of the tablets of God. What was the date? Well, months, reckoned, of course, as they are in the Bible as lunar months, are roughly 30 days long. So, if the revelation took place on the 7th of the third month, then, of course, that leaves 23 days until the end of the third month, the beginning of the fourth month. On the 17th of the fourth month, the tablets were broken. I'm going to reiterate, I can't provide you with explicit scriptural verses that corroborate the exact date, but it certainly had to be around then. And we do have an ancient tradition that marks the 17th of the fourth month as the day of the breaking of the tablets. So, returning again to our theme of learning the lessons of history. If we were to relate to the breaching of the walls of Jerusalem as a tragedy that needed to be commemorated, we would be right, of course, on the one hand, but on the other hand, we would also be missing the point. It's important for us to always bear in mind that events aren't isolated. There's an ongoing dialogue taking place all the time between God and man, between God and each and every one of us as individuals, and more broadly, between God and the world. The breaking of the tablets in the fourth month isn't an isolated event either. It connects everything that unfolds afterward in the history of Israel and in the history of the world. It is perhaps especially germane for us to bear in mind here that in the aftermath of the sin of the golden calf, even by consequence of Moses' petition for Israel to be forgiven by God, even once God accedes to that petition, still and all, in Exodus chapter 32, verse 34, God says to Moses, "Now go, lead the people to the place of which I have spoken to you. Behold, my angel will go before you. Nevertheless, in the day when I punish, I will punish their sin upon them." Full history. Crime and its punishment. But on some plane that inevitably will elude our limited understanding in this world, there's a connection between the crime and its punishment, the breaking of the tablets and the breaching of the walls. And while on the one hand, obviously a critical component of the lesson to be learned by that juxtaposition, by our observing the commemoration of the breaching of the walls on the same date as the smashing of the tablets, there is, of course, that connection of crime and punishment. There is also a critical measure of consolation. How consolation? Because we know what happens in the world, even as it eludes our understanding, even as it mystifies and baffles us. It's part of the system. And there's someone who's running the show, who's ruling over it. It's not merely haphazard. God is in charge. You know, I feel compelled to interject here. As many of you may know, in the long, blood-soaked history of the Jews, particularly in Europe, all too often, our enemies specifically looked for these red-letter dates of destruction and calamity in order to grind some extra salt into the wound, in order to impose upon the Jews ever more suffering, ever more persecution. In particular, with respect to the date in the fifth month, the 9th of the commemoration of the destruction of the Holy Temple, from the expulsion of the Jews of Spain in 1492 to various massacres and atrocities perpetrated by the Nazis during the Holocaust, the 9th of Av was a favorite date for imposing ever more suffering upon the Jews. And undoubtedly, our enemies thought that they were making it all the more unbearable for the Jews to impose that extra measure of suffering on such an ominous date. And in doing so, of course, they missed the point completely. Irrespective of the extent to which they claimed that they were acting in the name of their God, these godless monsters failed to learn the most basic lesson of history for the Jews. God is running the show. And when a date like the 9th of Av reasserts itself as a date of suffering, a date of calamity, what, if anything, it drives home to the victims is God is still running the show. This isn't an incidental occurrence. It's part of a vast continuum. It's part of an inscrutable plan of God. It doesn't provide us with the answers, but it does provide us with the conviction that there are answers, even if in this world we'll never know them. So there's a measure of consolation even in that basic realization that binds together the smashing of the tablets with the breaching of the walls, in commemorating them both together on the anniversary of the smashing of the tablets, the 17th of the 4th month. But there's one additional dimension that I think it's critical for us to stress in this regard. And that is a much deeper, much more profound measure of consolation. Let's start with the smashing of the tablets. Smashing of the tablets, well, this was the handiwork of God. So of course, it's a calamitous occurrence when the tablets are smashed. Of course, that's true on the one hand. And yet, first of all, of course, the tablets are restored. God tells Moses to ascend the mountain, and God gives Moses the second set of tablets, but on a deeper level. On the tablets, God's word, God's Torah, God's teaching was inscribed upon stone. But there's a much more sublime level that maybe becomes further amplified when we lose the written component. And that is maybe an additional element of fulfillment of the mandate that is expressed in Exodus chapter 13, verse 9. The goal that God's teaching, God's Torah, should be in your mouths, not just on the tablets. And maybe even more sublimely, as expressed in Proverbs chapter 7, verse 3, inscribe them upon the walls of your heart, not just upon stone tablets. And most tellingly, in the promise of God through the prophet Jeremiah, in Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 32. This will be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says God. I will put my Torah, my teaching, in their innards, and write it in their hearts, and will be their God, and they will be my people. When we learn the lesson from the crime and its punishment, we can become worthy of a far deeper and far more sublime connection with God's Word than could ever be attained merely by having that Word upon the tablets. So we don't just get the restoration, we have the potential to rise even higher. The punishment, and it is a punishment, isn't expiation. It's not suffering. It's rehabilitation. And it can even serve as a ladder to rise even higher than we ever were. That's with respect to the tablets. What do we have to say with respect to the breached walls of Jerusalem? Breached walls of Jerusalem, what could possibly come of that? Well, of course, the walls of Jerusalem are initially rebuilt. That takes place in the time of the Second Temple. But of course, that's only temporary because the wall is destroyed again, breached once more by the Romans in the destruction of the Second Temple. But then, with respect to breached walls or even no walls, it's instructive for us to recall what the prophet Zechariah reports earlier on in his prophecy, in chapter 2, beginning with verse 5. I lifted up my eyes again and looked, and behold, a man with a measuring line in his hand. Then I said, where are you going? And he said to me, to measure Jerusalem, to see what is the breadth of it and what is the length of it. And behold, the angel that talked with me went out, and another angel went out to meet him, and he said to him, run, speak to this young man, saying, Jerusalem shall be inhabited like unwalled towns, because of the multitude of men and cattle that shall be in it. For I, says God, will be to her a wall of fire round about, and will be the glory in the midst of her. Jerusalem ultimately breaks forth beyond its walls. And of course, I can't help but add here, and it's inevitable historical observation. Jerusalem was always a walled city. It was a walled city when Israel entered the promised land in the time of Joshua. Besides the times that the walls were broken by its enemies, Jerusalem was almost always surrounded by walls until Jerusalem, just as in the words of the prophet Zechariah, burst forth beyond its walls, not because of destruction, but because of a God-given blessing that was without any historical precedent. Jerusalem, in the second half of the 19th century, for the first time, broke forth beyond its walls. It was initially a small little foray. Those of you who are familiar with the geography of Jerusalem know when the neighborhood of Yemin Moshe, Mishkenot Sha'ananim, was first built facing Mount Zion, where to this day Moses Montefiore's windmill can be seen. The Jews who were begged to go and live there were afraid to sleep overnight outside of the walls because of all the bandits and highwaymen that prowled the countryside. A very humble beginning. And today, if you look at a map of Jerusalem, you see a map of the entire city, and there's that tiny little area, someplace in the lower right side of the map. That's the walled city of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem has expanded so phenomenally beyond those walls. You see the beginning of the fulfillment of the prophet's words. before our eyes. So, breached walls, undoubtedly, at the time of the destruction by the Babylonians and by the Romans, spelled tragedy. But there's also a measure of consolation. Breaking out of the walls, going beyond the walls. And inevitably, can't help but add, why? Why is it so important to go beyond the walls? Because after all, what ultimately is the goal? What is the mission of Jerusalem? As expressed in Isaiah at the beginning of chapter 62, for the sake of Zion, I will not hold my peace, and for the sake of Jerusalem, I will not be still until her righteousness goes forth like radiance, and her salvation like a burning torch. And the nations will see your righteousness, and all kings your glory. That radiance, that splendor of Jerusalem, that might have been cut off from the rest of the world, hidden from view, as it were, by the walls, will break forth, engulf the entire world. The whole world will know. The light of the world is Jerusalem. That's because, again, the city has broken forth beyond its walls. The breach, then, can be a harbinger of something so very greater. And inevitably, in this vein, I feel compelled to return precisely to the point with which we began. That is, God's promise through the prophet Zechariah. Remember, in chapter 8, verse 19, about the fast of the 4th and the 5th and the 7th and the 10th being transformed into days of celebration. In the very next verse, if you ask, what effect does that radiant splendor of Jerusalem going out beyond its walls have in the world? Thus says the God of hosts, it shall yet come to pass that there shall come people and the inhabitants of many cities, and the inhabitants of one city will go to another saying, let us go speedily to entreat the favor of God and to seek the God of hosts. I'm going too. And many peoples and mighty nations will come to seek the God of hosts in Jerusalem and to pray before God. Eventually the world gets it. The unwalled Jerusalem, with the breached walls going beyond. Once we learn the lesson, once we hear the message, just as in the case of the smashed tablets, the punishment becomes a consolation. So too the breached walls. They were punishment. They become a consolation. And maybe that's the critical message with which we should conclude. Observing the commemoration of both events together, not on what we might have thought was the appropriate biblical date, the 9th of the 4th month, but rather as we observe it to this day on the 17th. Observing both the commemoration of the smashed tablets and the commemoration of breached walls is that message of consolation. When we learn the lessons that God is teaching us, and He's teaching us these lessons, admittedly, through history, but beyond history, then indeed we become worthy of God's blessings. The broken heart that can be the most complete heart possible if it helps to bring us back to God. You know, we have a very apt saying in our tradition that generally speaking, people feel it's a disgrace to use broken vessels. But as for God, God's favorite vessels, so to speak, are broken. In Psalm 34, in verse 19, God is near to them who are of broken heart, and he saves those who are of contrite spirit. And likewise, in chapter 51, verse 19, the sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken, a contrite heart. God does not despise. And finally, the promise in Psalm 147, in verse 3, God heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. Broken heart, smashed tablets, the breached walls, all this brokenness. What a phenomenal recipe for restoration, for God's consolation, for God's blessings. When we put together all the pieces, we're able to discover how to use all these broken pieces for that ultimate goal of returning to Him and becoming worthy then of His everlasting blessings. God bless you.